You're listening to the TALKBOX Side. You're listening to the TALKBOX. Let's talk about it. Talk about it. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Yeah, you're listening to the TALKBOX Side.
Hey, you guys, welcome to the TALKBOX show. I'm your girl, Sonja G. And you know what we say here on the TALKBOX, every day above ground is a good day. We got another day, another opportunity to get some things right that we didn't have quite right on yesterday. We above the dirt and the dirt is not above us. And therefore we have permission and authority from the big guy to live an abundant life. We have a special show on today. I need you guys to go ahead and share the live. This is great information. And I have a very dear person on with me today. They're my blood relative, but more so an attorney and former district attorney down there in Atlanta. We have Robert James. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I am blessed by the best. I cannot complain. Okay. I'm just saying. But it is good to have you again. Thank you so very much for agreeing to come on and talk about the kids and the law. So tell the people a little bit about you that may not have seen you on TV like I did.
Well, I'm from Murfreesboro. I'll start there. Went to high school there, and Riverdale High School, and went to MTSU. I left Murfreesboro in the mid '90s and came to Atlanta and took a teacher's assistant job temporarily until I got into law school. And I got into law school and I became a prosecutor, and I was a prosecutor for 17 years in all before I went into private practice, which, as your listeners have heard, part of it included being an elected prosecutor. I was the elected DA in DeKalb County, Georgia, which, Decatur is the county seat. And I think everybody's heard of Decatur that listens to rap music and that sort of thing because it's kind of popularized. But yeah, that's where I was district attorney, the elected DA. Before I was the elected, I was an assistant and a child abuse prosecutor, a special prosecutor, all of those things while I worked my way up. Yeah.
Oh, wow. You did a little more things than I even knew about. But let me ask you this. You said that you were doing child abuse cases as well?
Yes, I was a child abuse prosecutor. I was the first African-American child abuse prosecutor in the history of the county. I did that in the early 2000s where I represented children who have been abused. So,
And the first African American, isn't that area predominantly Black?
It is the office. So I came to the office to work in 2001. At that time, the district attorney's office was predominantly white. The county had shifted and was about 55% African American, but that was sort of a new development. The DA was still white. We hadn't had our first African American DA yet. And just about all the public officials were in the office is probably about 95% white. And so they had, and I think there were 4 African American attorneys that were working in the office at the time. And so they had never had anyone that looked like me in that position before. And so I was the first. I was the first a couple of times. I was also the first African-American prosecutor. I wasn't elected in Rockdale County, but I was an assistant, which is where my first job was in Rockdale County. I was the first African-American to work in Rockdale, but I ran for office and, assumed the head of the office in 2010 November. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, that's great. You did a lot of groundbreaking things. I can imagine that wasn't the easiest thing to do, especially in the climate that we find ourselves living in. But I want to jump right in about the kids and the law. I wanted to ask you a question. I wrote a couple of things down. What is the difference between the juvenile and the adult court system?
Well,
What's the major?
sure. The primary difference between the juvenile and there are a lot of technical differences, but the primary and the philosophical difference between the two is that the juvenile system is designed by its very nature to rehabilitate, right? To make people
Okay.
better, to fix things. And so if a child gets in trouble and is in juvenile court, it's really it's light court, but with a heavy dose of social work and love and a lot of other things. I've been in juvenile court before, and the judge is inquire, mama's there, daddy's there, grandma, whomever the guardian is, and the judge is inquiring what's going on, what's his grades, what are his or her grades like, how did we get here? The judge talks to the young man or the young lady, oftentimes like they're their own child. A lot of patience involved in it, and and everybody, prosecutor, probation officer, defense lawyer, judge, they get together and oftentimes they try to find solutions to a problem. And at the end of the day, a child's record is sealed, right? So they get a fresh start when they become an adult. The adult system isn't like that at all. Once you turn 17,
Right. It's over.
it's punitive. The goal of it is not to
Yes.
rehabilitate. And I think people think it is, but no, the goal of the adult system is not to rehabilitate, it is to punish. And
Yes.
so once in Georgia, 17 is the age of majority for being prosecuted. Once you turn 17, as you say, it's over. You're being prosecuted as an adult, and nobody's trying to fix you. They're trying to punish you. And oftentimes, whatever mistake you make stays with you for the rest of your life. And the punishment's obviously a lot more harsh.
Yeah. Oh, that's awful. But in thinking about the kids, and I was speaking with someone on last week in regards to the children and how they are being just shuffled through the system. I know I've heard from what is it called? From something to the grave, the thing that
the pipeline, the
pipeline.
school to prison pipeline, from cradle to the grave. They have a lot of sayings to kind of describe, what happens, with children, particularly our children who get caught up in the system disproportionately.
Okay. What can you tell us today as parents and grandparents and as loved ones in regards to our kids? What's going on and what do we need to do to help our children?
Yeah. Well, parenting is paramount, right? Resources, making sure your kids are engaged, that they're, playing, they have extracurricular activities. So they're busy, because idle hands really are the devil's workshop, right? When kids don't have summer jobs or aren't involved in, summer programs or after school work, that really does, give them time to get in trouble. And we've seen kids that are engaged and have people in their life, get in trouble as often. Mentoring is a big deal, right? Kids who don't have mentors, who don't have a father figure or a mother figure in their life, it's a big deal, and we have a lot of single parents, and that's just the way, the world is now. No criticism attached to that. But if you're a single parent, particularly if you're a single mom raising a boy, then, you need to seek some sort of male guidance, whether it's through your church or a coach or a mentoring program, something like that. The other thing I would say is make sure you're very aware of who your children's friends are, their peers, because oftentimes kids, when they go through adolescence and teenage years, it's a very formative time of their life, and other kids, and their behaviors and their activities imprint upon the children they're around, and so they start to mimic that behavior and do some of the things that they do. I mean, heck, even us as adults, if we hang around the wrong people doing the wrong things for long enough, we find ourselves saying and doing some of the things that our circle is doing, but even more so with kids. And so those are some things that we can do, and make sure your child is educated, as you can educate a child as to, the law, what some of the pitfalls are.
That is something. Before we came on, we were talking about the 7 deadlies that kids sometimes get shuffled through the system and skip the juvenile process. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the seven deadlies, that's just sort of slang that us lawyers use here in Georgia. It's not an official legal term, but we just call certain offenses the seven deadlies. And so, and I'll list a few of them. I won't go through all of them, but murder is one, armed robbery is one, rape is one, and they're obviously, other offenses that if a juvenile, and by a juvenile, I mean someone as young as 13 years old, I'm going to say that again, a child as young as 13 years old, if they commit one of those offenses, then they're most likely going to be charged as an adult here in Georgia, right? And what that means is that they're facing adult consequences. Now, the judge and the prosecutor's office has the option of leaving it in juvenile court, but more times than not, that's not what happens. It is elevated, and the children are charged as adults and they face adult consequences, which means that a child as young as 13 years old can get a life sentence here in Georgia, and that has happened. So that's not something that's kind of far-fetched or fanciful.
But when you think about a 13-year-old, a 13-year-old is not his brain is not fully developed. The decisions that he makes is truly not adult decisions. So how is that so?
It's so because the legislature says it's so, but it doesn't make it right. So look, I've got a 13-year. I've got one of my children's going to be 13. In about 45 days, right? I cannot imagine, her being, prosecuted, tried, and treated as an adult, and then being taken away from me, and for the rest of her life and being incarcerated, right? Children do things that, anybody that's had children or been involved with kids, they know they do things that absolutely make no sense. And sometimes they do really, really bad things, right? But, there should be, you cannot have justice without compassion, right? You cannot have justice without grace, but you also can't have justice without common sense. And, so I think, yes, it's, a law that would lock up a 13-year-old for the rest of their life is absent grace, it's absent mercy, but it's also absent common sense because 13-year-olds aren't like, 30-year-olds. That's just the reality of it.
Right. Well, even that. So if a 13-year-old commit one of the seven deadlies, and they're tried as an adult, are they housed with the adults?
Not until they reach the age of majority or they become an adult. So if a 13-year-old were tried as an adult for the offense of murder, okay, they're going to go to a juvenile facility and they will be there until they turn like 17, 18 years old. And then they're going to be transferred in with adults and they'll be there, for a life sentence. And so a life sentence in Georgia means you're there for 30 years until you're eligible for parole. And so that 13-year-old in theory would be there until they were, 43 years old before they even had an opportunity to go before a parole board.
There's nothing that we can do about that if our kids find themselves in that position. That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like you said, children do things. When I'm with my grandbabies, they'll do something. My 7-year-old grandbaby will do something, and I'll go, "Why did you do that?" And he'll say, "I don't know."
Yeah, no, that's right. My son does the same thing, and I say, you know what? I believe you. You really don't know why you did it. Because your little brain is just not developed. No, it doesn't make sense. I'm not here to justify it, and if I were here to justify it, I wouldn't do a good job because I don't really think there's good justification for it. I think one of the most famous or infamous cases in Georgia history was one of the first big cases in Georgia history where a kid was prosecuted. And I forget his real name escapes me, but the nickname was Little B, right? And Little B had, I think he was, there was a father with his two sons in the car, and the father, I believe, it's been years ago, had his bright lights and he was shining, and there was a discussion or an argument about turning the bright lights off and not blinding it. And of course, the grown man, addressed a 13-year-old boy, in a certain kind of way, which is basically like, you need to go sit down somewhere. And the boy shot him and killed him. Right.
The
Tragic.
father?
No, the boy shot the father, not his own father, but the other. So there was a father with his two kids, and then he ran across this boy who was 13. The 13-year-old boy shot and killed him during the dispute. And he was tried and given a life sentence. And, and this happened when I was in law school. And I think he's just recently been released from prison. And I've been a lawyer for 26 years now. And I think it was either when I was in law school or before I went to law school was when this happened. But it was, maybe shortly before. But he's just been recently released. And it was, it's look, I'm not here to say that, people shouldn't be punished or kids shouldn't be punished for doing really bad or serious things. But, everything has to be tempered with common sense and some mercy. Right.
Yes. So what are some of the common things that minors get into?
And so I'm glad you asked me that. So one of the biggest pitfalls that kids find themselves into is not the 17-year-old, not the 13-year-old or the 14-year-old himself going out and committing the murder or committing the armed robbery, right? That's, everybody's like, well, if a kid kills somebody, I'm going to take it a step further. We have something in Georgia called party to the crime, which is basically, criminal accomplice liability. You're an accomplice to a crime. And so what that essentially means is if a boy who is 13 years old is hanging with a 18-year-old boy and a 21-year-old young man, and that 18 to 21-year-old decide they want to go, rob the guy who runs the corner store, right? We've seen this scenario a bunch of times, I know he's got a lot of money down there and, let's put some mask on and go rob him, right? And let's say the 13-year-old boy doesn't even go in the store. He just stands outside and he acts as the lookout for the robbery. Okay. Wow. He doesn't have a gun. He doesn't go in the store. He just looks out and makes sure that he tells them if anybody's coming, the 13-year-old. Okay. And during the course of this robbery, there's a tussle and the store owner gets killed. Right. The 13-year-old boy is going to be charged with armed robbery and is going to be charged with murder.
Wow.
And
this had scriptures that says bad company corrupts good character.
Yep. As an adult, he will be charged. And so he will be facing a life sentence. And he never had a gun. He never physically, touched or engaged the store owner. He didn't fight with him. He didn't even go in the store. He just acted as a lookout. And now the 13-year-old boy is looking at spending the next 30 years of his life in prison before he's even eligible for parole because he acted as a lookout for a murder and he got charged with murder. And that is the most common scenario where we see kids being caught up in this, young kids in particular. They don't have the weapon, the gun, the knife themselves, but they're acting as a lookout or as an accomplice.
Well, that seems very harsh for someone, one, his age, two, he was on the outside of the store, didn't go in, don't even know what's going on in the store. Yeah. So basically, we need to make sure that we drill it into our kids' heads that everybody in your circle is not in your corner and you don't have to go along with everything. I know when I was younger, my mom would say, why did you do that? Well, Cookie was doing it. Why did you do that? Because Peaches was doing it. And mom would say, if she was jumping off a bridge, would you do it too? I don't know. But, and that's just the case. But that seems like a hard thing to keep your kid from, especially this day and time. Children want to fit in. They don't want to be the outcast. They're being bullied a lot in school and in their neighborhoods. And so what would you say is a good, I guess, fence of defense with your child in regards to that?
Well, so you have to be proactive, right, in two ways. One way is being proactive by talking to your children about the danger, the very real danger that they're in. about how they could be held accountable for what somebody else does just because, they have minor participation. And quite frankly, if they're there, and even if they don't have any participation at all, if they're with them, the police, they're going to arrest everybody. And someone like me as a lawyer is going to have to sort it out later. Right. So the child, even if I get him out of jail or get him off, as it were, he may spend, 4, 5, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, or a year or 2 years in jail waiting for trial while I'm trying to unravel this stuff. So even if I win, the kid still loses because he's lost a year or two out of his life. He's been pulled out of school. But so the company that you keep is very important, and kids need to understand that, not just from a moral standpoint, right? Because kids are tired of us adults preaching morality, but what kids do understand is oftentimes is kind of the practical side of it is what could happen to them, right? So they need to understand that. The other thing is that us as parents or guardians or aunties, uncles, grandparents, what have you, we need to be proactive and be engaged and understand who the people that are in our children's life are. Look, my kids spend maybe 25% of the day with me and 75% of the day with their friends and their teachers during the school year. That's just a reality. That is so your kids, yes, you're shaping them, but they're being shaped just as much, if not even more, by the company that they keep. And as a parent, you have a responsibility to be nosy, right? To know who that little boy is, to know who that little girl is, to know who their people are, to meet their parents, to know what they're doing, right? Because you would have the best kid in the world, right? Who's mannerable, who gets good grades, who's on the straight and narrow path. But if they're keeping company with children who act in the opposite way, then ultimately they're going to find themselves in trouble, and they may find themselves on the other side of some of these laws that I've described. Most states have laws similar, and so I'm certain there's something. I'm certain Tennessee has accomplice liability. I'm not aware. I don't think there's a state in the country that doesn't have accomplice liability.
Right. Well, let me just stop for just a moment. I just want to let everybody know who you are. The former district attorney in DeKalb County, Robert James. And I want you to make sure that you're sharing the live, you guys, because we need to know our kids are our future, and we need to know how to protect our children when it comes to kids and the law. So go ahead, Bubba D.
That's me.
So I had to get that out of there.
That's
But the other thing that I had too, what rights do kids have when questioned by a school resource officer or the police?
So typically they have very similar rights that adults have, right? They don't have to be, they can refuse to answer questions. They can ask for their parents and say, I don't want to answer any questions till my parents come here, right? The Fifth Amendment, the right against self-incrimination applies to everyone, whether you're an adult or a child. Typically, kids don't know to invoke their Fifth Amendment rights and not answer any questions, but nobody can compel anyone in this country to answer questions under most circumstances. I mean, there's a few narrow situations, like if you're pulled over, you've got to, give your ID and identify yourself. But beyond that, you don't even have to answer any questions if you're pulled over on the side of the road, and so, but, kids should know that, if they're in a situation, whether it's at school or in the street, don't answer any questions. Say, I want an attorney and I want to speak to my parents. Yeah.
So we need to drill that into their heads. Do the school have the right to search lockers and backpacks?
Yes.
Is that legal?
Yes, it is. Under many circumstances, under many situations, it's a very nuanced issue. One that, it would take me all morning to kind of go through all the different scenarios when they do and when they don't, right? So the Fourth Amendment is relaxed in some instances when you're talking about schools and, when administrators and teachers can search lockers and backpacks, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? And so I'll say that because I don't want to just kind of go down that rabbit hole, because it is a really nuanced situation. So.
Okay. And can parents be held legally liable for when their kids commit a crime?
Under most circumstances, no, but there are some situations where they can. We've got a case here in Georgia with a school shooting about an hour north of us, where the dad gave his underage kid the weapon, right? And the kid went to school and killed a bunch of people. Now, ultimately, gun laws here in Georgia, as in most states in the South, are pretty lax. And underage kids can have rifles, as as long as they're with their parents and hunting and things of that nature. But if you know that your child has issues, and you give him a weapon and he goes to school and shoots somebody, then you could, and I stress could, under certain circumstances, be in trouble.
Yeah. Oh wow. But the yeah, I guess you should be held liable if you're the one that give the child the gun. So what role should parents play if their child is accused of a crime? How should the parent handle that?
Well, the first thing the parent needs to do is make sure proactively that their child knows, because they're not going to automatically let the parent in, and I think that's what people sort of misunderstand the process. So when the police grab the kid, they're not going to say, okay, well, I'm going to sit here and wait for your mom and daddy to get here. You're going to have to, the child's going to have to demand and say, look, I want my parent, right? Same way it is when you're saying I want my lawyer, right? They're not going to automatically give you a lawyer. They're going to talk to you until you ask for one, right? And so educate your kids to ask for the parent, to ask for the lawyer, and to not talk. Now, when the child is charged with a crime, the biggest role that the parent needs to play is helping to secure an attorney for that child, right?
Right.
And if you can afford one, go hire one. If you can't, then you need to make sure the child gets the services of the public defender. They're lawyers too, and oftentimes they're excellent lawyers. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, in this age right now, we're doing a lot of social media. And so what kids post can be used against them. Is that true or false?
oh, it's absolutely true. I was a prosecutor for, like I said, 17 years. And one of the first things that our investigators did, particularly in our gang unit, when you start talking about evidence of children being active or a member of a gang, and we have gang issues here in Metro Atlanta, some pretty significant ones. We go to social media. Oftentimes our investigators will create a fake profile, and so you may have a 42-year-old man with big muscles and a beard who would who would basically catfish somebody, create a profile like they were a scantily clad, pretty young lady, bearing, pieces of her body, kind of like the Instagram model thing.
Yeah.
And, he posing as she would be online, talking to these guys, and they, and they accept them. And, then you can go on and you see the pictures of him, of the guy posing with guns, posing with money, posing with drugs, throwing up gang
All that
symbols,
stuff.
all of those other sorts of things. And so, once that arrest warrant comes out, they got evidence, and you gave it to them.
Right.
You
And
also see it in sex cases, right?
Mhm.
Where children have this thing now where, they like to film everything, and they like to take pictures of their
Yes.
genitals and text those pictures to other kids. We call it sexting, right? Well, like that's,
Mhm.
like you can get in real trouble for that in Georgia. Like, child, if you have a picture as a young person, if you have a picture of a young lady or vice versa, and you transmit that, you send that, that's transmitting child pornography. Yeah.
Wow. And that's just something that the kids are doing nowadays. That's sad.
Mhm.
Can a parent be fined or jailed if a child skips school?
Um, so Georgia has truancy laws.
Mhm.
And so under Georgia's truancy laws, which aren't enforced that often, it is a misdemeanor for a child under a certain age, to be truant, to miss an excessive amount of time, and for a parent to allow that to happen. I'm probably the only prosecutor in the history of the state that's ever used that law as a prosecutor. And so we had a really, really, really bad truancy issue in DeKalb County back in the early 2000s. And it was like an epidemic. Our school system was failing, and there were children who were, and I'm not talking about children of parents of like teenagers and middle schoolers. I'm talking about kids that were like 7, 8 years old. Like, the only way you get to school is if your mom and dad take you to school. I'm not talking about the 13-year-old who is supposed to walk to school and never gets there. So we had kids who were 8 and 9 years old who hadn't been to school in like 2 years. Right.
What?
Yeah. Those were the extreme cases, but routinely we saw kids missing, anywhere between 30 and 50 days of school that were like 7, 8 years old, and they weren't sick; they just weren't going. But there were a lot who hadn't been in 2 years, and we sent the parents notice that they were in trouble, right? But we weren't going to prosecute them yet. Just come down, meet with the school, get your kid in school, meet with the school social worker, develop a plan where your kid's going to school and, everything's going to be fine. Well, for all the parents who did that, life was fine. But for the 15 to 20% that ignored us, we had to do something, and we couldn't allow these kids to just be chronically truant. And so we partnered with the sheriff's office and the local police departments. We got warrants for their arrest, and we went out and rounded them up, we only had to do it once. Because after that, when we had the meeting saying, hey, we're sending you this letter, you need to come to this meeting to work with us to get your kid in school, we didn't get ignored anymore. And so, and we didn't put any of them in jail long term. It was just sort of, they got booked to get their attention, so.
Well, that's crazy. I don't know about the parenting nowadays, but when I was raising my kids, I wanted them to go to school.
Yeah.
That give you a break. So I don't know what was wrong with those parents. We're getting ready to wrap it up. This time have gone by so quickly, but I got a couple of things I wanted to mention too. What resources may be available for at-risk youth is one.
Yeah.
What do you, and also, are there how can communities and churches get involved in prevention efforts?
Sure. Make sure, and it really is simple. There's no magic in this. And what I'm going to say, everybody's heard before. Make sure that your child, or the child that that you care about, that you have a relationship with, is involved in extracurricular activities, right? If even if they're not good at sports, soccer, basketball, baseball, where they're in a community of other kids and there's a coach and there's something productive that they're doing. If it's a teenager, make sure that they have a summer job, that they're not just sitting around. Old people, you say, idle hands are the devil's workshop, and that is absolutely true. We know kids that aren't engaged get in trouble. Mentoring. It saves lives. It shapes futures. You've got big brothers, big sisters. You've got churches that do it. And if they're not doing it, they should have a mentoring program where they're doing rites of passage and mentoring for young women and young men. All these are things that are in our power to do, and that we should be doing in our communities in order to rescue and save our children.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I tell you what, this went by really, really fast, but I really, really appreciate you coming on and opening our eyes to what our kids can do. So just to reiterate, I tell you what, we need to watch who our kids are around and be nosy. We need to be nosy. Are we our brother and sister's keeper? Yes, we are, but we're definitely our kids' keepers. And back in the day, when I used to get in trouble down the street, I would get a whooping by the neighbor, and then I'd turn around and get a whooping at home, and then mama would say, wait till daddy get home. So you get 3 whoopings now. But this day and time, I don't know what's going on with society other than the Bible is just true, that in the end times, right is wrong and wrong is right. And so we just need to stay on top of our kids and our grandkids. Well, Robert, I was going to call you Bubba D again.
It's okay.
I know your sister was on last week and everything was candy, which is fine. That's how we know each other, right? But is there anything else you want to say while we close up?
No, look, I've enjoyed being on, had a good time talking with you this morning. And, if I can ever do anything for anybody, I'm Robert James. They can find me at attorneyrobertjames.com, attorneyrobertjames.com.
attorneyrobertjames.com. Y'all heard it here. If you ever need him, give him a call at attorney. Say it again.
robertjames.com, and our phone number is 404 lawyers.
Oh, neat. Okay. Well, I tell you what, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I know I've been trying to catch you for a long time. Finally caught you. So, but thank you so very much for coming on. And you guys, remember, we have permission and authority to live an abundant life, but we got to bring our kids along with us because our kids are definitely our future. Well, you guys, we had attorney Robert James on, and you know who I am. I'm your girl, Sonja G, here on the Talk Box. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place. Bye. Thanks, Robert.
Talk about it. Yeah, listening to the Talk Box.